and welcome to episode 86 of Trails in the Pod. I'm Colin. That's Kevin.
No Kiseki episode today. We are doing something deeper, something more honorable. Colin, we are fulfilling a contract. We are doing one of the games in the game challenge.
That's right. For new listeners or for those who just need a refresher, Kevin and I have created a tradition starting last year in which we would challenge each other to play one game of our choosing, so that we could make content about it on the podcast. I challenged him to play a Final Fantasy game. That game has changed, and he challenged me to play a Dragon Quest game, which game has changed. This year, we also opened it up to the audience to pick a game. They picked two. So now we have four game challenges this year. Now we're officially halfway done because, Kevin, you and we've played Dragon Quest V.
We've done more than play Dragon Quest V. We've watched the movie adaptation. Now, why did I pick a DQ game? Well, one, I
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
love Blizzard from Dairy Queen, so I'm sure there was a subliminal something going on there. But Dragon Quest is one of the pillars of RPGs for JRPGs. Its theme was in the Olympics when they were in Tokyo. How much more a part of what it means for the JRPG genre can you get? So I wanted something foundational, something that can look at the intellectual genealogy of the games that we play today, that we're playing in the podcast right now, and see maybe not straight descent, but relations. What paths did we go on? What paths could there have been? The series seemed like a no-brainer. I didn't know hardly anything about it, so I chose the third one basically on a whim. I believe our listeners made the case for Dragon Quest V as this is a much better game. Do this one, not the third. So that's why.
Yeah. So Dragon Quest V was one of those nominated by the community, and then we decided not to put it not to do it because we were going to do Dragon Quest III. But then I was like, Dragon Quest V, at least as far as I'm aware, is just an objectively better and more important game than Dragon Quest III. So if we want to be foundational, and I want Kevin to enjoy the games that we're playing. So I kind of push for Dragon Quest V, and I think that I made the right call, just given your reaction to it. I've never played Dragon Quest V before. I've played Dragon Quest One on the NES, and I've played a bit of Dragon Quest 11. To be honest, that game was great, except that the soundtrack is so repetitive that I had to stop playing. That is not the case with Dragon Quest V. Kevin, we also played different versions of the game, kind of like we did with Ys Books 1 and 2. I played the original Super Famicom release with a fan translation, and you played it on the DS. So maybe we can talk a little bit about why we decided to play the versions that we played. Why don't you start?
First, I want to make something clear for the audience, the big gap in time between these two versions. Yours came out in 1992, and we'll talk about how early that was for the kind of game that we got. I was blown away by that. The DS version came out in late 2008 for Japan and early to middle 2009 for the rest of the world. That is a 17-year gap. There was a lot of change, changing to the graphics, the mechanics, more party member, four, not three, a new fan translation, which we'll talk more later, but I absolutely loved. It was
But it's not a new fan translation, it's a new official translation.
a new official translation, and let me say, I am shocked they made the choices they did. It's on the screenshots I sent you. I'm sure you're a bit surprised as well.
Well, it was a different time a decade and a half ago, which, oh my God, it was a decade and a half ago when that version came out.
Overall, though, what did you think of DQ5, the version that you played?
So, as I said, I played the original. It's a pretty literal fan translation, which means that it doesn't have a whole lot of the character that the modern translation has, which I think talking to you about the game impacted my enjoyment a little bit. If I were to replay Dragon Quest V, it would be on the DS version because I'd want to experience that. And I think that you had a more fun time, just in terms of also like minimal grinding, maybe slightly easier, stuff like that. For me, I chose the Super Famicom version because I am a retro gamer. I played it on my Super Nintendo with an EverDrive. I wanted to have the authentic original experience. And on the whole, I did like it. It was the first retro game I've played since we played East Books 1 and 2 on my PC Engine. I need to make more time for retro gaming, so it kind of reminded me of my love for that. One thing I will say, though, is that I was really into it for certain periods, like the beginning. I thought was perfectly paced, like minimal grinding, just enough to remind you, hey, this is a JRPG from 1992. But enough to like see, okay, here's how the characters are developing. Plot's kind of interesting. And then the first half of the second part was also pretty good. There were a couple of places where I got, especially near the end, where I grinded a lot. I'm talking like it in the end, near the final dungeon. I talked about this on the podcast before, but I had to spend a week doing multiple hour grind sessions just so I can get enough money to get late game equipment. The upshot was that I could beat the boss first try, thanks God. I know it took you like 2.5 hours to do that, so I'm glad I put in the investment. But when you have to add 10 hours to the end of a game to beat it, it kind of made me forget some of the things that I actually liked about the game. So I came off of the game thinking it was maybe a 7 out of 10. I could kind of understand why the West prefers Final Fantasy to Dragon Quest, especially since people have claimed that Dragon Quest V is the best game in the series. And I'm like, well, if this is the best that you got, I'm not sure if I'm a Dragon Quest fan. And I do want to talk a little bit about a comparison with Final Fantasy that I was thinking about. But when we were watching the movie, which we'll talk about at the end of the episode, it kind of reminded me just how much was there and how much had stuck with me. Because the other thing is that I basically played most of this game a month ago and then only recently finished it. So that kind of skews how I'm viewing it as well. So I was reminded a lot of stuff that kind of surprised me. So I'm thinking I'm raising my score to like an 8.
That context is important. I'm glad you shared. I played the DS version because that was what I found to be the easiest to emulate on my computer. That's how I played it. I have a standing desk and treadmill I use for work. And so when I was not busy, but I'm a loyal, conscientious worker, if anyone from OC is listening, I would play it while walking, getting my steps in on my treadmill. So that's basically why, the only factor for the decision. But it was a momentous one. The graphics are updated, obviously. The mechanics are updated. You can have four party members, not three. That really changed things. You have party chat to get environmental chit chat that really made the characters more fleshed out. The names were different. The dialogue, I think it was easier. I did not really have to grind. I did some in the end, not much. I ended the game level 30-ish. The 2.5 hour boss fight, I gotta admit, Colin, I gotta confess, I didn't know there'd be two stages. I used all my MP, all my items on the first one, and I thought, wow, that was really easy. I didn't even bother healing towards the end. This is great. And then we got the second, more powerful, and I didn't bother leveling up or equipping the other monsters in my little caravans. It was my front line four, and that was it. So that I saved with the solid state saving literally every
Mhm.
turn.
You mean save states?
Yeah, save states, because I realized, wait, I don't want to have to restart this again and again. I'll do a round, I'll save. Oh, I died, go reload. I'll do a round, I'll save. And then that's
So not only did it take you 2.5 hours, you cheated. You cheated on the last boss.
you cut out Colin. But okay, moving on.
Well, so let me
What
ask.
kind of game?
I had a question that I was going to ask and I forgot what it was. Oh yeah. So this is something that you should keep in mind as we're playing JRPGs. You should always assume that the final boss has at least one other form, if not two.
Yes, like I should have. I played enough for East, for all these Kiseki games, for Fire Emblem.
Yeah. Every single Trails game we played has had multiple.
It's on me, bro. It's on me. But I want to give a brief overview of what is Dragon Quest V. What kind of game is it? JRPG released in 1992,
Mhm.
like we said. You play a silent protagonist. I'll call him Luca in preference to Madison, which is the original intended localization, which I just personally don't think it's a very good name. You play Luca through three stages of his life. as a kid with his dad, 10 years later roaming the world fighting, and then 8 years later with your two children. It's a combat takes place with encounters from an overworld, random encounters for the most part. You have magic, you have essentially melee attacks. Magic uses mana, melee just attacks the same. There's not that much differentiation, not that much variation in combat. Everyone can use spells for the most part. Everyone's attack isn't all that different from each other. So combat as a whole can get a bit samey. I felt you don't have much, well, I'm going to choose this person over that person for the combat. It's more maybe some role playing, maybe you want a healer or DPS, but the actual mechanics of a major component of the game I thought were adequate at best, maybe a bit boring towards the end. One of the great,
I have a question about the combat actually. This is about version differences that actually we haven't talked about. In the Super Famicom version, there are multiple enemies on the screen. You
yes,
cannot choose individual enemies. You can only choose the type, and then the game
yes,
will automatically assign the damage. Is that the
yes,
same in the DS version?
that is the same.
What did you think about that?
Knee jerk, I didn't like it. Eventually, I just incorporated that into my strategy and a small
Mhm.
handicap, if I'm being honest. So it didn't really harm my enjoyment of the game. I like this game quite a bit. I just thought it was annoying at first, and I don't really get it. From a game design perspective, what do we gain or lose from that non-choice, essentially?
Yeah, I don't know why they do it. It might just be like a remnant of its age. You have to remember that Dragon Quest II is the first game to give you multiple enemies on the screen. At least I'm pretty sure. The first one, every single
Yeah.
combat was just one enemy. So it could be just this is how they made it work back then, and so they've been carrying it over. Dragon Quest is really big on tradition. But if anybody in the audience knows why they made that design choice, please let us know. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I mean, I did, but
One of the major points of DQ5 is you can recruit your enemies. Your party does not consist of only humans. You can include monsters you have defeated and leveled up. It's like a precursor to a franchise that maybe our listeners you may have heard of that about recruiting monsters, fighting with them. It's called what's the name? Colin. They made a TV show out of it.
you mean fucking Pokemon?
Oh yeah, I think that's pretty well known.
But I want to talk about that a little bit because I'm a huge Pokemon fan. I learned how to read playing Pokemon One. I play Pokemon once or twice a year. I've been trying to explore fan projects because they're better than what Game Freak is putting out. Playing DQ5, I saw a lot of DNA of Pokemon in there, and it's not just the monster systems and the storage systems. That's basically like the PC box, but I'm talking about moving tiles in the final dungeon. That reminded me a lot of the puzzles in Celadon Game Corner, in Silphco, in the first game. Also, the daycare system. Clearly, Pokemon has taken that up. Plus, the whole gambling aspect. There's like multiple ways to gamble in this game. I never really thought about it, but I'm pretty sure that the presence of game corners in the original Pokemon games, like for the first couple of generations, I think that that is because of Dragon Quest V. And just realizing that kind of blew my mind.
I wonder how do you get these specific influences that can be traced from DQ5, from the Dragon Quest series onto Pokemon specifically because they wanted to do something similar, and how much of it is like this is so enormously influential, everyone was getting influenced by it, whether it was conscious or not.
So I think it's a great question. I think that there is some direct parallels in the games that are pretty specific. In particular, there's one creature in Dragon Quest V that I looked at that and I'm like, that's coughing. That's just straight up the Pokemon coughing. That I'm pretty sure Pokemon just took and put it in the game. So that's a pretty like one-to-one thing. But the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that I'm pretty sure anyway, that monster catching games did not exist before Dragon Quest V. They invented this game invented that genre. There are other monster catching games out there. There's Dragon Quest Monsters, for example. The Shin Megami Tensei series has a lot of this, but Dragon Quest V, if it didn't completely invent it, certainly put it on the map and laid out a standard by which all of the other ones have to follow. And I think just from the generic expectation alone, Pokemon is clearly pulling off of the standards that Dragon Quest V set.
That was 4 years gauge gap difference between them. The first Pokemon came out in 96. This came out early to middle, I believe, 92, before even Final Fantasy V.
Yeah, and games are created a lot quicker back then because they're not these big AAA things. The technology is similar, so they certainly had time to play that game, realize that they like that system, and then put it into Pokemon.
Yeah.
But some innovations, trading, for instance, the implementation of multiplayer in Pokemon is a huge innovation off of the system that we have in Dragon Quest V, because there is no multiplayer, and I think that it kind of contributed to Pokemon having this huge boom.
What are your thoughts on the game? In particular, I want to hear what you think about the story. Because this is, I think, much deeper than the story that we played for East 1 and 2.
Oh, without question, without question. So I have to say that at first my impressions weren't that great, and by that I mean when I had finished it, I was like, this is a pretty simple save the world story. There's some interesting things in it, of course. I think that the implementation of a generational story where your character starts as a kid, you're learning things from your dad, it's introducing you to the world, and then you see your father die, you become an adult, you fall in love, you have children. First time I've ever seen a fucking child rearing, like literal pregnancy in a JRPG. There's probably others out there, but I was like, huh, they're really going for that one. And then I think it's cool that at the end, I think that the idea of you lose a battle in the second third of the game, and so then you take control of your children, who I named Luke and Leia, because I'm a fucking nerd. And I think it's interesting that the son is the chosen one, not you. But I have to say that on the whole, I thought that the plot was kind of like a little bare bones. But as I said, when we were playing or when we were watching the movie, I realized that there was a lot of little moments that the movie didn't have that the game did that really contributed to the fleshing out of the world. I mean, looking at Prince Henry starting out as this little brat, and then, when he's enslaved along with you, he then becomes he changes his character. He has character growth, and helps you out throughout the rest of the game. The time when you're bringing your wife through a mountain range, and she has literal pregnancy sickness. It's these small touches that, the more and more I think about them, make the plot of the story way more interesting than I had thought. It's kind of like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth in this way, where I don't think that the overall plot is actually that amazing, but the small moment to moment scenarios or episodes, that's really compelling. And certainly deeper than the Ys games that we had played. Trails obviously has a deeper story, but there is also something to be said about having a generational, wide-ranging story in about 30 to 40 hours versus a couple of years in how many games do we have in the Trails series? 12?
5 years spans from FC through Kuro 2, 6.
I think it has to be more than five, but I don't have the number offhand. But what I'm trying to say is that, I mean, obviously we love the Trail series, but especially as you get into the later games, uh, there is a tendency for the games to just get longer and there to be a lot of dialogue that maybe doesn't need to really be there. There's something to be said about classic RPGs and the alacrity of their pacing. I find refreshing sometimes. What did you think about this story?
This game had a vision for what it wanted to do in three discrete parts that built to a larger whole, and it accomplished that in a relatively short amount of time for an RPG, 30 hours, 40 hours in that range. And I think that is to its credit, especially it was one of, if not the first games to do something of this scale. So it was not relying on this past canon of how do you do something of that magnitude. It was creating the map, others would follow, modify, accept, reject as they wanted. But it was a trailblazer in the first and best sense of the word. First part, you play an illiterate 6-year-old. You get introduced to a lot of the core mechanics of the game. You have a starter quest of fighting bad but not too bad ghosts and villains. The tension ratchets up when you explore more of the world. You get introduced to court politics, to people who are bad, not just misunderstood levels. They don't quote, count the count, or at least mine did. The enemies were Sesame Street quoting. in the Upton Castle.
Yeah, that did not happen in
Yes.
mine.
So that also, reinforced this is the for kids starter dungeon. You get introduced to one of the companions, maybe a love interest, Bianca. Like the first part of the game, opening you up to the world, but in a mostly kid-friendly way until the end, in which your father, your protector, is taken away. You are thrust without that barrier into an awful situation, slavery. It then picks up 10 years later. You escape, you become your own person, you take on adult responsibilities, not just saving the world, but at a personal level. You get married, you have children, you start a family. That's taken away. I think it's really interesting how the game ends each act with a big loss, and it's very personal. You lose your father, your protector, and then it's reversed for Act Two. In the end of Act Two, you get turned to stone. Your wife gets turned to stone. Your children are kidnapped. You cannot protect them. The role that you were supposed to do. You are a mirror of your father's failure.
We do save the children before we get turned to stone.
Yeah, yes. Like I was saying, your children get kidnapped and you save them and you get turned to stone. But the instigating incident, again, it's not white political. Well, as a monarch, the personal and the political are difficult to extricate, but it's aimed at the family. End of Act One, aimed at the family. Act Two, the family. Act Three, also the family. The family is a core component of the game. I find really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, even right before we do the final boss, right, we finally meet the hero's mother, who I want to complain about the name for a second, but there were kind of like reunited with the spirit of Papa slash Pancrans, depending on your translation. Your mother is there as well. There's like one moment in which the entire family is together, and then you go off and you save the world, which I think goes to your point about reinforcing the family aspect. I do want to talk a little bit about naming choices in the new version. Some of them make sense. For example, in the original, the cat that you recruit, his default name is Borongo. I don't know what Borongo is supposed to mean. Saber makes more sense. In the movie, he's called Percy, and I think that's a good pun. There are a few names that should not have been changed from the Japanese. Your mother's name is one of them. In the Japanese, it's Masa, which sounds like they're trying to say Martha, which is an actual name, and so the fan translation calls her Martha. In the English version, her name is Mada, which, unless you're speaking in my accent, does not sound like a name, and then it just sounds like it means Mudda. So I don't know why they chose that. Even worse is the name for your other love interest in the English version, it's Mira. In the Japanese, it's so clearly Flora, and Flora is a name. Nira is not a name, unless there's a Nira listening to us, in which case I apologize. But at the very least, it's not a common name, and Flora is a common name. And I don't see why they decided to just change it. Like, even with Papas to Pancrats, it's not like Pancrats is a common name anyway. So why change it from Papas?
I don't know, Colin, but I appreciate the rant nonetheless.
Thank you for making me feel heard and valid.
Family is at the heart of Dragon Quest V. I think maybe that's why I really liked it, because the existential stakes, you have to save the world. We've seen that before. We see that a lot in RPGs. It's a joke how Act 1, Quest 1, go save the kittens, kill some rats. End of the game, go kill God. But, and I'm going to go on a limb, Colin, and say something.
Quite literally, that happened in this
Yes,
game. We went and saved a kitten, and then we killed a
yes,
god.
honest to God, I think speculative fiction, broadly speaking, fantasy, sci-fi, items of that nature, magical realism, the unknown is made comprehensible and legible when it's tied into familiar themes about that we can relate to with our perspectives and vantage points in the 21st century. Um, Arcane focus on the family as a mechanism to explore the League of Legends world. Game of Thrones, we identify with one family, the Starks. In these successor series, House of the Dragon, the Targaryens and the two factions, the Greens and the Blacks. Star Wars, the first trilogy, this Luke. We identify with people with their concerns that we can imagine ourselves, that we've experienced, we can empathize, or we can sympathize. And we see this here. we see the overarching save the world refracted through your father, your mother, your wife, your children. It's personal and it's relatable in a way that I don't think many of us are going to go be killing deities and helping dragons, but dealing with, say, an absent parent or Hudamiri, or how do you keep your children safe is much more common set of concerns and worries and experiences. I think that's really why it succeeds so well. Look at Kaseki. The relationship with Joshua and Estelle ground. It's a grounding factor that makes the society meaningful, and we care about it because we care about Joshua and Estelle and their relationships together. So by making family so important, they did it a long way, making the game successful as I see it, because it's bound with the plot.
I think you make a really interesting point about world building, in which you can't just like throw a fully constructed world at a player and then expect the player to be immersed. We need these more human, emotional ties, these personal ties to attach to the characters. And then through that, we experience the world. Which brings me to a question that I have for you. I've talked to you about it a little bit, but Trails, we do not have a silent protagonist, right? Estelle, Joshua, Lloyd, Ellie, they are fully fleshed out characters in their own right. We're going to see the same thing in Final Fantasy VII, and we're going to see the same thing when we play Suikoden. But Ys books one and two, Adol is silent. He remains silent up until he's eight, and even then, he's pretty silent. In this game, the hero is silent, except for when you meet him very briefly when you're a kid and he's time traveling, then he speaks a little bit. But still, silent protagonist. The point of the silent protagonist is supposed to be that you as the player put yourself into the role of the player character and experience the world through him. But it does prevent you from having these same kind of personal attachments to the player character, qua player character. What's your take on silent protagonists? Did you find that it hampered your enjoyment? Did it help enhance your enjoyment of this game?
To mirror you, I'm gonna go on a rant about silent protagonists like you did about names. Colin, Colin, Colin. Sometimes I understand why a silent protagonist may be necessary. Did the mechanics exist in East 1 and 2, even in DQ5 to allow branching conversations? I would be surprised. I don't know. I cannot say for certain. I'd be surprised. Do we then? So that's fine. I don't like it. I accept it. Colin, dear Colin, you played a lot of JRPGs. Can you tell me the mindset? Can you tell me why people think let's have a silent protagonist and then gaslight the player, lie to the player, and make them believe all these other fleshed out characters can somehow detect the personality or make one for the silent protagonist, and then they think they invent a personality for this silent character, then they gaslight the player into imagining, oh yeah, this person is so cool. I love how open he is. I love how caring. I'm like, no, you are lying to me. You are trying to make me believe something that is not true. This person has the personality of wet cardboard. Three Houses, Byleth is this caring, sympathetic teacher. No, it's wet cardboard. It's not. No one should be so creepily attached to a doll-like mute weirdo who's good at killing things. People should not be. Nira and Bianca should not be fighting, and Deborah in the DQ version, in the DS version, should not be fighting over Luca. It boggles the mind. It's insulting. We should. I get it for those games. Three Houses, no. From what I've seen of Persona 5 Royale, absolutely not, Colin. We have progressed beyond the need for a silent main character. It is a bad sign. It should not be happening.
I have to say, I think it works really well in Persona 5 because there's a lot of input from the player about how you react to things. That there, the self-insert of the player into the role of the protagonist works in a way that doesn't always work in other times. I'm going to defend Persona 5 on that one. That being said, I understand where you're coming from, definitely. To some extent, the characters react to the actions that you take in these games. So, like with Fire Emblem Three Houses, as you point out, I mean, it's not just that Byleth is good at killing
Yes.
people. You, as the player, are also talking to your students and trying to cultivate their interests, which yes, it's not like Byleth is actually speaking, but you are taking the personal interest in the student, and that can make the student feel valued. So I can see why there's somewhat of an attachment there. But I think the weakness of it really comes out not while you're fighting over, not while like Mira or Flora and Bianca are fighting over you, but in the development of the relationship after that, where like you have Bianca, who's the one I chose. And Bianca is this intelligent, strong, independent woman, has a fleshed out character. Clearly, there's like a little bit of like childhood nostalgia between the two, the player character and Bianca, which you experience. So, I mean, I think that part worked out well. But once you get married, you can go back to certain locations and you can have conversations between husband and wife in which, Bianca says that she loves you. And once that happened, I'm like, setting aside the fact that we just got married 15 minutes ago. So I'm not really sure how this relationship has developed. I understand that there's an abstraction of time in a JRPG. But it's not like the player character has ever told Bianca what he likes about her. There's not a mutual respectful relationship there. It is Bianca revolves around the player, and the player revolves around the world, and things are happening to the player. And so on that, I don't like as much. And the Final Fantasy series is a great example in this era of having fleshed out characters where these characters have independent existences of their own. I'm not saying that they're perfect. Final Fantasy IV is clearly an early effort. And so like Cecil's character arc begins and ends in the first 5 hours. And his relationship with Rosa definitely remains a bit more on the Rosa is the damsel in distress and Cecil has to go save her all of the fucking time. But Rosa and Cecil have their own characters, and you can see how they can like talk to each other and have feelings for each other, irrespective of what the player wants. I have to say, I prefer that mode of storytelling. And there are other ways that I think Final Fantasy IV is a superior game than Dragon Quest V, but that's one of them. That I felt that a lot of the characters in Dragon Quest V I can still think about and remember years after I've played it, whereas I'm not sure the same will be true with Dragon Quest V.
It's Final Fantasy IV, you mean?
Yeah. Well, I'm saying that Dragon Quest V, I'm not going to remember
Yeah.
a lot of the characters. Like Henry will probably remember. I'll probably remember Bianca. You will probably remember Sancho because of his outrageous accent in your version, but he's very forgettable in mine. The man who daughter he tries to get you to marry his daughter, and then you decide to marry Bianca, and he adopts you as a son anyway. I'm only going to remember him in the fact of that reaction was really stupid, and it shouldn't have happened.
Rodrigo Castelli.
Yes, who apparently is extraordinarily Italian in your version.
Well, yes, he said, that he said Bjorn, the monster you fight outside Mostre Ferrado, is sealed and tight like meat and ravioli. He said that I have to be a good, strong king, unlike Nero's ciabattas, which are weak.
Could you
Just
imagine just like casually insulting your daughter's bread making abilities? Tell me a bit more about the translation. I mean, I've seen some of your screenshots, and people have reacted to how like Sancho is an outrageous Mexican uh, to an almost racist degree. But I also recognize that as you were watching the movie, you were missing a lot of these localized touches. Um, you were missing the Italian stereotypes. You were missing a lot of these other things. So tell me about how the script impacted your enjoyment of the game.
it impacted it in a positive way. The people or a village had a I'll just call it a stereotype because that's what it was. Say, I think Hayward was the village where you go, they want you to go fight this monster that turns out to be Barongo or Saber. That I read was a Cornish one where they swallow the H's and talk in a peculiar manner. The York Pancras' brother, Albert, speaks like an upper class British person. He says, like, honest to God, give it the old what to. His chancellor's name is Jeeves. Sancho is, I'm gonna say, it goes veers into racist territory for his accent. It makes them memorable in a way that oftentimes NPCs, non-voiced NPCs with just text, were then not memorable. Was it extreme? Yeah, I admit that. Do I think it helps me remember who they are for a while yet? Also, yes, I think it's overall a positive thing to do for the game when you don't have the voice actors.
I don't have a follow-up.
Now, we've danced around this a number of times. There's, there's like two and a half different versions of Dragon Quest V. I think one and a half can be called,
Oh, but hold on. But hold on. Before we talk about the movie, can I talk
yeah,
about combat a little bit? So I want to get your thoughts on the combat as well. But to me, you had alluded to this. I don't quite agree that every character plays identically, in that each character has their own strengths. Certain monsters can learn certain spells. Your human characters, they have different spells that they can learn, but and sometimes you have to choose, swap party members in and out. Okay, I need healing on this, or I need this specific monster to fight that. Like I use Golem for a little bit to swap in and out with other characters in the final boss. But you're right that the experience of combat, there's not a lot of decisions to be made. And I found that there were two things, one of which is superficial, literally superficial. The other one is more substantive that impacted my enjoyment of the combat. The superficial part is the first person perspective. You don't see your characters, you only see the enemies. Functionally speaking, this is exactly the same as seeing your characters in like 2D Final Fantasy, where all your characters are on the right hand side of the screen and the enemies are on the left hand side of the screen. It does not make a difference gameplay wise whether or not you can see your characters. But aesthetically, I liked the ability to see the characters that I was playing with, see them do actions, see them react. It adds something for me. But also, the thing that Final Fantasy has done pretty well in Final Fantasy IV and in Final Fantasy VI, and also in Final Fantasy V, depending on the classes that you're taking, is that the characters there, they feel unique. Yes, in the story, yes, artistically, because they have like character portraits that help us visualize who they are. But in gameplay, they also have unique abilities. In Final Fantasy VI, you only have like a couple of people who can use magic. Then you also have characters that have certain special skills that you do special inputs on in order to create extra special attacks. It requires you to make more decisions on the fly of how you're going to deal with an enemy encounter. Whereas with Dragon Quest, you have three choices basically: fight, spell, or run. And I swear that the run button is broken half the time. It's way too difficult to flee, and way too punishing to flee. But like, okay, I'm just mashing the A button to hit go. Yes, in other RPGs it can turn into that as well, especially if you're like grinding or something, but there's almost no real decision making except in a very few specific fights that are a bit tougher, like Bjorn or the final boss. And for that reason, I think that Final Fantasy IV and the other Final Fantasies were just way more gripping to me, not just on a story level, but on a gameplay level. And that's why people say that Dragon Quest is bigger in Japan, Final Fantasy is bigger in the West. I can definitely see why Final Fantasy, especially that SNES and PS1 era, is just superior to Dragon Quest. I like Dragon Quest. I'm way more of a Final Fantasy fan.
yeah. I want to get into combat in a brief way also. You can attack with your melee attack. You can defend, which I usually do not think is hardly ever a good move. You can do spells, do offensive damage, buff, debuff, or heal. Many characters, say Sancho, do not have the full range of spell abilities. You are not exclusively locked into a role of DPS tank. This is way too early for that, but you'll generally know who is the mage character, who can do more support, damage spells, attacking. There's rough parameters. And you, for the most part, you do the same thing with them each turn. The healer will generally heal. Offensive spell will zap. The attacking will attack. So it's not exactly button mashing, but I would call it predictable, if that makes sense. One. And two, I think it suffers. And again, I don't want to say games from like 15 years later have it, so this one should. You cannot control who attacks you, like who attacks who. You would want, obviously, your tougher members to be attacked and your weaker ones to not. But the enemy, I don't know what the AI, how they decide. And I think not having that is a bit unfortunate.
And you say this, I think it's interesting because sometimes you excuse Dragon Quest for being early, but Final Fantasy IV has a system in which you can put your tougher units on the front line and your weaker units in the back line. And the backline units will take half damage, but they deal half physical damage, but they can still do full magic damage and stuff like that. So even in that is a decision that you have to make in order to do proper party management. That is nowhere to be found in Dragon Quest.
No. So that's good to hear that they could have had, so it's good to hear that other options were available and that they weren't picked. I do not think is a good thing for this game. It's a bit of a malice.
It's a bit of a mouse, but this is on the whole a very positive review. We enjoyed our time with Dragon Quest V.
Yeah. And it's tough to review a 30, 40 hour RPG in 60 minutes or so.
And that's why we're going to keep talking because we liked this game so much that we also watched its movie adaptation. And I have to say, I enjoyed the experience physically of watching it. Kevin and I, we don't live in the same state. We do this remotely, but we use Teleparty to sync up our Netflixes so that we could watch it at the same time and like talk to each other. I thought that was a great thing. Uh, Kevin, why don't you tell us a little bit about this movie, Dragon Quest: Your Story?
Fairly new. It was released in 2019 with dubbing in multiple languages, not just Japanese, but English, but Spanish, Thai, French. A lot of time and effort and money went into making this film. English VAs, for example, the two main leads, Yuri Lowenthal and Stephanie Shea, they're not small names. They're not cheap. A lot of care was put into this film. The art I thought was gorgeous. I thought the voice acting was quite good. I thought the animation style, it reminded me of Pixar or Disney much more than anime. It was brilliant. The plot.
And that soundtrack. We talked a lot about the soundtrack. I mean, absolutely beautiful orchestral renditions of these songs.
So you open up with some weird movie copies of the 8-bit version of the game that you played.
16-bit.
And then 16-bit of the game that you played yourself, calling the SNES.
Yeah.
And then we get through the animation style of the game, but they skip a lot. It's fragmented. And we were commenting on that, like, oh, they skip this. That's kind of good. Oh, they're not going to show that. And I think it was maybe affecting how we were going to review and rate the movie. Like, the standard game, it assumes you played it. We've seen that before with the Trails OVA. And then, Colin, and then in the last 15 minutes, something just wild happened that is so divisive. You and I, on retrospect, loved it. I think a lot of other people hated it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this game, it's a truncated version. This movie is a truncated version of Dragon Quest V. As you pointed out, they're cutting some stuff out. We made a comment very early on that it seemed like it would be impossible to really enjoy this movie if you hadn't already played Dragon Quest V. Because you're not going to be able to understand some of the stakes, some of the character arcs that are being compressed. Then at the end, they reveal that the main character is actually in a virtual reality simulation for a few hours. They say he's been in there for only a few hours, and that this is a celebration of the impact that Dragon Quest V has had on an entire generation of people. And we have to keep in mind that, this movie is made for the Japanese audience first and foremost. Dragon Quest was so popular at that time that when a new Dragon Quest game would come out, I think it was three that this happened with, all of the schools nationwide closed because they knew that nobody would show up anyway because they were all going to go play the new Dragon Quest. Like that's how integral this series is to that generation of people. And so then seeing it through that lens, that a lot of the thing that this, not just that this movie was made for fans, but that the whole premise of the plot is about a gamer reliving some of his most beloved memories as a child in this new format. I'm going to be honest, it kind of made me emotional a little bit. And all of a sudden, a lot of the complaints that I had turned into positives. Because I enjoy celebrating the beauty in things. And it made me think about how all of the times I've been going through hard times and JRPGs have let me escape that. Something I should probably listen to right now. But it touched me in a way I didn't expect. And I think that a lot of our listeners expect us to hate it. I love that change. I love that twist.
Was great because the items that we were pointing out, it shows the developers, the producers, I'm not sure what to call them, filmmakers, they knew about that and they accounted for it. Like, yeah, of course, we only get the highlight because that's what the player is experiencing at the forefront of his consciousness with the filler like sprinkled in as memory, going from one stage to the next. It made the message about like oftentimes you would get, I think, a theme of don't run to escapism and avoid the real world. Here it seemed almost flipped of the escapism and the fantastical not ground you in the mundane, but they do affect you in a positive way in the mundane. How he enjoyed it, his life by playing because of these memories he had playing games. And I remember a lot of memories I have, over the age of 30, playing games, COVID lockdown, Call of Duty with friends, or LAN parties in the basement
Yeah.
in middle school and high school, impacted me in the mundane, in the real world. So I get what's going on here. I think it was a brilliant way, a subversive way of squaring the how do you adapt a multi 10-hour long RPG into a bit under 2 hours. You lean into the medium with the form and the structure and the content are intertwined where each is building off of the other. It's if I said it's almost postmodern, would you accept that?
Well, you'd have to explain to me how it's postmodern.
It's not, there's no like objective, it's a blending of objective realities into something that's greater than the whole, or there's no.
While you're trying to think through that point,
Okay, it's what is grounded in this, the use of metafiction, the importance of narrative structure, the unreliability of one's own cognitive narration, intertextuality. How is this not postmodern?
I've never understood how intertextuality means that something is postmodern. Things have been intertextual since literally Homer. So I mean, look, if you want to call it postmodern, you can. These are these are not things that I typically think about. But I will say,
The Dragon Quest movie game is a postmodern work of literature, and I will hang my hat on this hill, and I
sure,
will
man,
die on this hill.
you can do that if you like. What I took away from that ending is that just from a pure narrative design function, it managed to transform this from a kind of a schlocky, I'm not going to say substandard. We enjoyed it. But lots of things were missing, and there's not even twins in this version, right? They just to give birth to a son that is then the chosen one. It's a very like almost bare bones adaptation, and we can understand why this is very difficult to do. Um, but it took that and it said, no, 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 this is not what you think it is. In fact, this is a celebration of video games as a medium. This is no longer a video game adaptation meant to widen it to a larger audience, like say the Super Mario Bros. Movie, which was great, but like, the Super Mario Bros. Movie isn't about Super Mario as a video game. It's about the Mushroom Kingdom and Mario and stuff like that. This is a celebration of video games qua video games. And that really resonated with me. It wasn't ashamed of the fact that Dragon Quest is a video game series. Not that Super Mario necessarily is, but like it puts it there very front and center in a way that I really liked it. I don't know.
No, you're right. There's often this even residual shame that when people say, look at the, Baldur's Gate, brilliant RPG released last year. Like, it's, even outside of the fact it's a game, it's art. This Dragon Quest V, your story revels in the fact it's adapted from a game. It revels in its origins as a video game, and it bold-face declares without any room for contradiction, games matter, which I think is important.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah. Do we have anything else that we want to say about Dragon Quest V before we wrap it up?
Even discounting the changes they made for the DS version, what we got, what you played from the early 90s, amazing to think how such a leap, only 4 or 5 years from East 1 and 2, and 4 or 5 years after this into the mid 90s, what would become the standard. The pace of change was electric back then. 4 years ago, a game from 2020 is not as catastrophic, oh, bad term, as not as monumentally different. it's a it was a special time in gaming history. It was the Wild West. I'm really looking forward to looking at other such games of this proverbial Wild West when anything was going. I loved the game. The movie was great. The last part, especially, it made me like, enjoy the game more. I think they were both solids, 8 out of 10. For me, for a pretty modern game. And you know, Colin, how much I like my conveniences and my creature comforts.
Yeah, I mean, this entire time we didn't even talk about how much of a pain in the ass the inventory system is, because the overall package was just, a fun, fantastic experience. Something that I'm very excited about, though. So the next game that we're playing for the game challenge is going to be Final Fantasy VII. Originally, I had said Final Fantasy V. After playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, I decided if Kevin is going to play foundational games, he really needs to play Final Fantasy VII. And so that's the next one that we're going to do. But unlike E's Books 1 and 2, in which I played the original and he's played a remake, unlike Dragon Quest V, in which I played the original and he played a remake, you cannot play Final Fantasy VII Remake. It is a different game. So we both must play the original. You can get the original on modern systems, but it's the same base game as the one that was on the PlayStation 1. So we will no longer have to reconcile version differences. We'll be playing the same thing.
For the first time in the challenge.
For this year's challenge, I mean, we both played the same version of Fire Emblem Path of Radiance and what was that shitty game you made me play? Planescape Torment.
Planescape Tournament. Yeah, I wanted a Fire Emblem game, and then you wanted to branch out into Western RPG. So
I
you
did
picked
not want to
Planescape.
branch out into Western RPGs. And it's because of that game I forbade you from nominating one this year.
Please don't gaslight me, Colin. But you know who's going to be gaslit?
Crossbell.
I bet because Mirror Troy instigated this because he's evil. Next episode, when it's out, will be about chapter 5.
No, it won't.
Chapter 4
Yes, it will. Chapter 4.
of Trails to Azure.
I'm looking forward to playing it.
Until then, as always, I'm Kevin. That's Colin. See you next time.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye bye.